I was just a boy, no older than 12 summers, when the shadow first fell upon St. Joseph's. Our village, nestled deep within the verdant folds of the valley, was accustomed to shadows, the long, cool ones cast by the ancient oaks in the late afternoon, or the fleeting ones of clouds scudding across the sky. But this was a different kind of shadow, one that seemed to seep into the very stones of the convent, bringing with it a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. We called it Black Veil, though no one would dare say it out loud. Not even the village elders who spoke in hushed tones of old prophecies and forgotten curses. I remember those days with a clarity that time has failed to dull, each detail etched into my mind like a carving on an old gravestone. My name is Thomas, and I was the youngest of 7, perpetually underfoot and perpetually curious. My days were spent exploring the winding paths through the woods, fishing in the babbling brook that fed into the village well, or perched precariously on the roof of our barn, watching the world unfold beneath me. From that vantage point, I had a perfect view of St. Joseph's, its gray stone walls rising majestically above the tree line, framed against the distant hazy mountains. It wasn't a grand abbey, not like the ones Father Michael spoke of in his sermons, but it was venerable, ancient, and undeniably imposing. For as long as anyone could remember, St. Joseph's had been home to a small order of Benedictine nuns, women of quiet devotion who lived lives of prayer and contemplation, largely separate from the bustling life of our village. They were a constant, a reassuring presence, like the church bell chiming the hours or the changing seasons. Their existence was a whispered comfort, a testament to the unchanging rhythms of faith and tradition in our small, forgotten corner of the world. The nuns rarely ventured into the village, save for Sister Agnes, who would collect alms and supplies once a month. She was a kindly, stoic woman, her face a road map of gentle wrinkles, always clad in the traditional black habit and wimple that gave the order its distinctive silhouette. Her eyes, though often downcast, held a warmth that even a boy like me could perceive. She moved with a quiet dignity, her presence a silent benediction. The other villagers revered her, offering their modest contributions with humble bows and hushed greetings. I often wondered about the lives of the other sisters, cloistered away behind those high walls. What did they do all day? Did they ever laugh? Did they ever feel the bite of loneliness? Such questions were dismissed with a wave of my mother's hand, or a stern glance from my father. Their world was not ours, they said, and it was not for idle speculation. Yet the convent held a powerful allure for me, a place of mystery and solemnity. I often imagined secret passages and hidden gardens within its ancient confines, fueled by the fantastical tales spun by my older brother William, who delighted in terrifying me with stories of phantom monks and wailing spirits. The first subtle shift, though I didn't recognize it as such then, came with the changing of the seasons. Summer, with its long, sun-drenched days, gave way to a particularly wet and gloomy autumn. The skies seemed perpetually bruised, and a cold, damp mist clung to the valley floor for days on end. It was during this time that Sister Agnes, on her usual monthly visit, seemed different. Her shoulders were a little more stooped, her gaze more distant, as if preoccupied by some unseen burden. She still offered her quiet blessings, but the warmth in her eyes seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a weary sadness that tugged at my young heart. My mother noticed it too. "She looks tired, poor soul," she murmured to my father one evening, stirring the embers in the hearth. "The cold is getting to her, perhaps." But I suspected it was more than just the cold. There was a tautness around her mouth, a slight tremor in her hands as she accepted the basket of fresh bread my mother offered. It was the faintest ripple in the otherwise calm waters of our existence, a discordant note in the familiar melody of our lives. Then came the new sisters. We learned of their arrival not from Sister Agnes directly, but through whispers carried by the wind and confirmed by the miller, who had seen their carriage pass on the main road, shrouded in the morning fog. They were, it was said, from a distant order, seeking refuge at St. Joseph's after their own convent had fallen into disrepair or faced some unspecified hardship. Their arrival was unannounced, without the usual fanfare or explanation that accompanied such significant events in our small community. It was simply a fact, accepted with a shrug and a nod, yet their presence brought a subtle alteration to the convent's already quiet demeanor. The usual faint sounds that occasionally drifted from St. Joseph's, the distant drone of plainsong, the rhythmic clang of the bell for vespers, seemed to diminish. The silence from the gray stone walls became deeper, more profound, almost oppressive. It was as if the very air around the convent had grown thicker, muffling all sound, holding its breath. I remember standing on the barn roof one cold, bright morning, the kind of morning that promised crisp air but delivered only more chill. I squinted towards the convent, trying to discern any sign of these new arrivals. I saw nothing. The gates remained shut, the windows dark like vacant eyes. The silence was unnerving. Even the birds seemed to give the place a wide berth. It was unlike the usual gentle hum of life that permeated the valley. My imagination, always eager to fill voids, began to conjure images of silent figures moving behind the convent walls, their faces hidden by the deep shadows of their habits. I imagined them, these new nuns, as solemn, spectral figures, their faces pale and their eyes watchful. It was a childish fancy, perhaps, but it felt strangely real. The absence of the familiar sounds, the deepening quiet, stirred a nascent unease. Within me, a feeling that something was amiss in a place that had always been a bastion of peace. My curiosity, however, was a stubborn thing. One afternoon, emboldened by the desire to catch a glimpse of these mysterious newcomers, I ventured closer to the convent than I ever had before. The path was overgrown, less used than I remembered, suggesting fewer visitors had trod it recently. The autumn leaves, wet and slick, crunched under my worn boots. As I neared the high stone wall, a strange, faint scent reached my nostrils. It was not the sweet smell of incense, nor the comforting aroma of beeswax candles. It was something metallic, earthy, and strangely sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. A shiver, unrelated to the cold, ran down my spine. The air grew heavier, pressing in on me, and the silence intensified, becoming a tangible presence. I hesitated, my heart thumping a quick, uneven rhythm against my ribs. A primal instinct, one I didn't understand then, urged me to turn back, to flee this place that felt suddenly alien and unwelcoming. But my youthful audacity, coupled with an insatiable need to know, pushed me forward. I pressed my ear against the cold, rough stone of the convent wall, hoping to catch a stray sound, a hint of the life contained within. Nothing. Only the faint, almost imperceptible drone of the wind through the barren branches of the old elm trees that lined the convent grounds. The overwhelming quiet was unnerving. It was the kind of silence that suggests not absence, but rather a deliberate suppression of sound, as if the very air was holding its breath. I looked up at the Gothic arches of the chapel, its stained glass windows now dark and opaque, reflecting nothing but the gray sky. There was a sense of profound stillness, a waiting quality that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It felt less like a place of quiet devotion and more like a tomb, sealed off from the world. I pulled back from the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my childhood fantasies of secret passages now replaced by a chilling sense of dread. The black veils, once symbols of piety, now seemed to my young, impressionable mind to embody an ominous mystery, hinting at secrets hidden within their folds. I turned and ran, the strange, metallic scent lingering in my nostrils. the profound silence of St. Joseph's echoing in my ears, chasing me all the way back to the safety of our village. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of the shadow. The metallic, earthy scent, like something sickeningly sweet and rot, clung to me for days after my ill-fated venture to the convent wall. It permeated my clothes, my hair, even seemed to settle in my nostrils, a constant, faint reminder of the unsettling silence behind those gray stones. I tried to wash it away, scrubbing my hands raw with lye soap, but it persisted, a phantom odor that only I seemed to notice. My mother, noticing my unusual quietness and my avoidance of her gaze, simply attributed it to the autumn chill finally taking hold. "You're coming down with something, Thomas," she'd say, pressing a cool hand to my forehead. "Too much time spent out in the damp." But I knew it wasn't a chill. It was a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, a creeping dread that had rooted itself deep in my young bones. The village, usually a vibrant tapestry of sounds, the blacksmith's hammer, the distant bleating of sheep, the chatter of women at the well, seemed subtly muted to me now. My ears strained, always listening for the familiar, comforting sounds that used to drift from St. Joseph's, but there was nothing. No plain song rising with the morning sun, no vespers bell tolling at dusk, not even the faint rustle of leaves, as a nun might walk through the enclosed garden. It was a silence that screamed louder than any noise, a void where there should have been the gentle hum of sacred life. This unearthly quiet was a constant gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, a discordant note that refused to be silenced. It felt as though the very air around the convent had been sucked out, leaving behind a vacuum of unnatural stillness. A week passed, then two, and Sister Agnes did not come for her monthly alms collection. This was unprecedented. She was a creature of habit, as reliable as the changing tides or the rising sun. Her absence was a gaping hole in the fabric of our village life, a tear that frayed the edges of our collective calm. At first, the villagers offered explanations. Perhaps the new sisters had taken over her duties, or maybe the convent's own stores were sufficient for now. Father Michael, a kindly man whose sermons often spoke of patience and trust in God's plan, suggested she might be unwell and recovering within the convent walls. His words, usually so soothing, seemed to lack their usual conviction. Even he, I could tell, was unsettled. There was a new, uncertain edge to his voice when he spoke. Of St. Joseph's, a slight furrow in his brow that hadn't been there before. The collective shrugs and nods of acceptance quickly morphed into murmurs of concern, then into hushed questions exchanged over fences and whispered in the aisles of the church. My older brother William, usually so absorbed in his own boisterous games, even noticed. He was 2 years my senior, tall for his age, with a mischievous glint in his eyes that often led him into trouble. "Have you seen the old nun, Thomas?" he asked me one afternoon, nudging my arm as we walked home from fetching water. "The one who smells of lavender and old parchment?" He meant Sister Agnes. "No," I mumbled, my voice barely a whisper. "She hasn't come." William frowned, a rare sight on his usually carefree face. "That's odd. Mother says she's always come, rain or shine, even during the harshest winters." His words confirmed my own anxieties, solidifying the vague dread into something more tangible. If even William, with his endless energy and scant attention to village happenings, was noticing, then the strangeness must be truly palpable. The quiet from St. Joseph's grew into a heavy blanket, smothering the faint sounds of the valley. The scent, which I had initially dismissed as my imagination, now seemed to drift on the wind itself, especially after a particularly heavy rainfall. It was more distinct now, unmistakable. The metallic tang became sharper, like rust mixed with something cloying and sweet. reminiscent of a slaughterhouse floor after the day's work, but with a sickly sweet undercurrent that made my stomach churn. I caught my mother sniffing the air outside our cottage one evening, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What is that smell?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. My father simply grunted, attributing it to the damp earth and decaying leaves, but I saw the quick, uneasy glance he exchanged with Mother. They noticed it too. They just didn't want to admit it. My unease festered. I dreamt of the convent, of silent figures moving in the shadows, their black veils merging with the deepening night. I would wake in a cold sweat, the metallic scent, strong in my dream-filled mind, and for a moment I would almost believe I could hear faint, desperate whispers carried on the wind. One particularly bleak afternoon, the sky a dull uniform gray, I found myself drawn back to the convent path. I told my mother I was going to find William, though I knew he was with Father Michael, helping mend the church roof. My feet carried me, almost against my will, back to the high stone walls. The silence was even more profound than before, a suffocating presence that pressed in on my ears, making them ache. The ancient elm trees, their branches skeletal against the bleak sky, seemed to lean in, whispering secrets only the wind could understand. I approached the tall, imposing wooden gates, usually latched but never truly locked, relying on the sanctity of the place for their security. Now, however, a thick, heavy chain, one I had never seen before, was wrapped around them, secured with a rusted, formidable padlock. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was new. This was different. The gates of St. Joseph's had always been open, an unspoken invitation to weary travelers and the devout. The chain was a clear, unambiguous statement. Keep out. It was a barrier, not just of wood and iron, but of exclusion, of separation. From the world, a tremor of fear, raw and unadulterated, ran through me. It was like a tangible sign, an undeniable confirmation that the gentle, welcoming convent was gone, replaced by something cold and forbidding. I pressed my face against the rough wood of the gate, peering through a narrow crack, my breath fogging, the cold timber. Inside, the gravel path was overgrown with weeds, untended. The small, usually vibrant flower beds Sister Agnes tended so carefully were now withered, their last petals clinging desperately to stalks. The air within the grounds seemed even heavier, colder, and then I saw it. Near the chapel doors, almost hidden by the drooping branches of an ancient weeping willow, was a faint dark stain on the gray cobblestones. It was irregular, too dark to be water, too extensive to be a shadow. My blood ran cold. It was the color of old, dried wine, or perhaps something else entirely. My childish mind struggled to comprehend, but an instinct, sharp and undeniable, screamed at me. This was not right. This was a place where light once lived, now consumed by an encroaching darkness. I stumbled back from the gate, the rusted chain a monstrous serpent in my sight, its presence a chilling pronouncement of a terrible secret held within. The metallic, sweet scent, which I had almost become accustomed to, suddenly intensified, overwhelming me with its dreadful reality. I gagged, spinning on my heel, and ran. The image of that dark stain seared into my memory, a harbinger of the horrors that were surely unfolding behind the unyielding black veils of St. Joseph's. The sight of that chained gate and the dark, ominous stain on the cobblestones sent me scurrying back to the village like a frightened rabbit. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the images were branded onto my mind, propelling me forward. I burst into our cottage, panting, wild-eyed. My mother, who was kneading dough by the hearth, looked up, startled. "Thomas, what is it? You look as if you've seen a ghost." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with fear and the lingering, dreadful scent. My father, whittling a piece of wood by the window, merely grunted, dismissing my agitation as childish overexcitement. He couldn't see what I had seen, couldn't smell what I had smelled. How could I explain the profound horror that had seeped into the very air around St. Joseph's? They would never believe me, a mere boy over the centuries of sanctity and peace associated with the convent. I spent the rest of that day and the following night in a haze of fear and confusion. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares of shadowy figures and the chilling echo of silence. The metallic, cloying scent followed me even into my dreams, a tormenting presence. The next morning, still pale and shaken, I sought out William. My brother, for all his bluster, possessed a surprisingly keen sense of observation and a bolder spirit than mine. I pulled him aside, away from the watchful eyes of our parents, and recounted my visit to the convent, the chained gates, the dark stain. He listened, his usual smirk replaced by a look of growing solemnity. His brow furrowed and a thoughtful, almost worried expression crossed his face as I described the stench and the eerie quiet. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on his tunic. "A chain?" he finally murmured, more to himself than to me. "That's not like them. Not like St. Joseph's at all." His acknowledgement, though subtle, was a small comfort, a validation of my disturbing experience. The growing unease in the village could no longer be contained. Sister Agnes's prolonged absence became the topic of every conversation. The women whispered about it while drawing water from the well. The men muttered about it in the alehouse. Father Michael, visibly troubled, called a special meeting of the village elders. I wasn't present, of course, but the hushed tones and grave expressions of the men returning from the church told their own story. The following day, a small delegation was sent to St. Joseph's, led by Father Michael himself, accompanied by our stoutest villagers, including my father and William. I watched them go from my vantage point on the barn roof, their figures growing smaller as they ascended the winding path, disappearing behind the trees that obscured the convent walls. My heart hammered with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. Perhaps they would find Sister Agnes, ill but alive, and everything would return to normal. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent. My anxiety mounted with each passing moment. Finally, as shadows began to lengthen across the valley, I saw them returning. Their steps were slower, their shoulders more slumped than when they had left. My father's face, usually firm and unreadable, was etched with a profound weariness. William walked beside him, his gaze fixed on the ground, his youthful swagger utterly absent. They looked as if they had walked through a waking nightmare. I scrambled down from the roof, my bare feet hitting the rough ground with a thump. I waited, barely breathing, as they approached. "What happened, Father?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. My father simply shook his head, unable to meet her gaze. It was William who spoke, his voice unusually quiet, strained. "The gates. They were chained, just as Thomas said. And the smell—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. A greenish pallor to his face. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Father Michael, his face pale and drawn, finally spoke, his voice a gravelly whisper. There was no answer. We called out, we knocked. Nothing. Only that silence. And the stench. God forgive us, but it smelled of death. His words hung in the air, heavy and chilling like the first frost of winter. The very air around us seemed to grow cold. Death. The word echoed in my mind, confirming the dreadful instinct I had felt at the convent gates. The following days were a blur of fear and inaction. The villagers, usually so practical and decisive, seemed paralyzed by the ominous silence from St. Joseph's. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by fear and imagination. Some spoke of a plague, others of a curse brought by the new sisters. The children, usually oblivious, absorbed the adult anxieties, their games growing quieter, their laughter less frequent. I heard whispers of the black veil, the old local, superstition that warned of dark forces lurking in the shadows, waiting to ensnare the unwary. The convent, once a symbol of solace, had become a source of dread. No one dared venture near it now. The path remained untrodden, the gates chained and silent, a grim monument to an unknown horror. Father Michael, despite his evident distress, tried to rally the community. He preached sermons filled with pleas for prayer, for faith, for courage. He spoke of the need to uphold the sanctity of life, even in the face of such inexplicable darkness. But his words, usually so comforting, seemed to fall on deaf ears, swallowed by the pervasive fear that had gripped our village. The men gathered in hushed groups, debating what to do. The magistrate from the nearby town, a portly, self-important man named Master Thorne, was sent for, but it would be days before he arrived. In the meantime, the silence from St. Joseph's continued its oppressive reign, a constant nagging presence that gnawed at our collective sanity. My own curiosity, however, despite the fear, refused to be quelled. The image of that dark stain, the unanswered questions tormented me. One evening, under the cloak of a moonless night, I slipped out of our cottage. My parents were asleep, their snores a low rumble from their bed. William, usually a light sleeper, was deep in a child's, exhausted slumber. I crept through the village, a small, solitary figure moving through the profound darkness, guided only by the faint light of the stars. The air was colder, crisper, and the metallic scent seemed less pronounced in the biting chill. My destination was the convent, the place that both terrified and compelled me. I told myself I was only going to look, to confirm what I already knew. But a deeper, unarticulated urge drove me forward. I reached the convent gates, the rusted chain a dark silhouette against the faintest glow of the eastern sky. The silence was absolute, a profound stillness that was almost deafening. I pressed my ear against the gate again, listening intently. This time, however, something was different. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, I heard it. A sound, not a voice, not a moan, but a rhythmic scraping noise, like something being dragged across stone. It was faint, distant, but undeniably there. My heart leaped into my throat. Someone was inside, and they were doing something. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the sound with the profound silence that usually emanated from the convent. The scraping continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm that filled the otherwise empty void. Suddenly the scraping stopped. A new sound emerged, a low, guttural thud, followed by a faint, wet slap. My blood ran cold. My imagination, already inflamed, conjured images too horrible to contemplate. I pulled back from the gate, trembling, my hands clammy with sweat. The silence returned, thicker, more oppressive than before, as if the very air itself had swallowed the horrifying sounds. I stood there for a long moment, frozen by fear and a dreadful certainty that something truly terrible was unfolding behind. Those walls, the black veils, once symbols of peace, now seemed to cloak a monstrous secret, a living nightmare that had taken root in the heart of our once tranquil valley. I turned, not running this time, but walking quickly, my steps muffled by the damp earth, my mind reeling with the unspeakable sounds I had heard. I knew now, with a terrible certainty, that the silence was a lie, and the convent of St. Joseph's was no longer a place of God, but a tomb. The sounds I heard that night at the convent gates, the rhythmic scraping, the guttural thud, the wet slap, echoed in my mind long after I had returned to the deceptive safety of my bed. They were indistinct, horrifying, and utterly alien to the peaceful rhythms of our village life. I lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had heard. My imagination, already a vivid companion, ran wild, painting pictures of unimaginable atrocities behind those walls. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the wind, a figment of my fear-addled mind, but the cold dread that settled in my stomach was too real, too persistent. It confirmed what my instincts had been screaming all along. St. Joseph's was no longer a sanctuary. The following morning, the arrival of Master Thorne, the magistrate from the nearby town, brought a surge of nervous energy to the village. He was a portly man, dressed in fine wool with a stern, officious air and a penchant for puffing out his chest. He arrived in a modest carriage, accompanied by two grim-faced, burly guards armed with long pikes. Their presence, meant to reassure, only heightened the tension. The villagers gathered in the square, watching with bated breath as Father Michael and my father, along with a few other elders, met with the magistrate. Master Thorne listened, his expression growing increasingly serious as Father Michael recounted the convent's strange silence, Sister Agnes's disappearance, and the unsettling stench. My father, with a reluctant glance in my direction, even mentioned my youthful ventures and the chained gates. I saw the magistrate's dismissive sniff. At my inclusion, a quick flicker of disdain in his eyes, but he seemed to weigh the gravity of the situation. "Preposterous," Master Thorne declared, after Father Michael had finished. "A convent? Sealed? And you speak of strange smells and noises? Nonsense! These holy women are devoted to God, not to some ungodly ritual." He dismissed the notion of foul play with a wave of his plump hand, attributing the villagers' fears to overactive imaginations and the isolation of our valley. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes darted nervously towards the distant convent, as if a seed of doubt had been planted, despite his bluster. He agreed, however, to visit the convent himself, accompanied by his guards and a few of the village men. It was his duty, he said, to ensure the peace and order of the region. This time, I was not allowed to go, despite my fervent pleas. My mother held me back, her grip firm, her eyes warning me against further disobedience. I watched again from the barn roof as the delegation made its way up the path, their figures receding into the increasingly bleak landscape. The wait was agonizing. Time seemed to stretch, each minute an hour. I imagined them at the gates, Master Thorne bellowing for entry, his guards trying to force the rusted chain. Would they break through? Would they find Sister Agnes, frail but alive? Or would they discover something far more terrible? The possibilities churned in my mind, a tormenting kaleidoscope of fear and grim anticipation. The sun began to dip below the western hills, casting long purple shadows across the valley. A chill wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves, and the metallic, sweet stench seemed to waft on the air, stronger now, as if sensing the impending confrontation. Finally, they emerged from the tree line. Their pace was slow, even slower than before. Master Thorne, usually so imperious, walked with a noticeable slump in his shoulders, his face a pale, sickly green. One of his guards had his hand clapped over his mouth, visibly struggling to suppress a retch. The other looked utterly distraught, his eyes wide with a horror that transcended any professional stoicism. My father and William, who had gone with them, were silent, their faces mirroring the magistrate's pallor. This time there was no need for questions. Their expressions spoke volumes. Master Thorne, barely able to speak, finally addressed the silent, anxious villagers. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual pomposity. The gates, they were indeed chained. And the smell, it was indescribable. He shuddered, a full-body tremor. We heard nothing, no sound, but we managed to break the lock. He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath. What we saw within the courtyard, I cannot speak of it. He gestured vaguely, his hand shaking. It was desecration. Utter desecration. His voice cracked. There were markings, and the chapel doors were covered in that vile substance. He finally choked out the words, his face contorted with a mixture of revulsion and profound shock. God help us. It was not a plague. It was an abomination. The word abomination hung in the air, heavier than any fog. The villagers gasped, some women openly weeping, men crossing themselves. The full weight of the horror settled upon us, chilling us to the bone. Master Thorne, regaining a semblance of his official demeanor, albeit a shaken one, declared the convent a crime scene. No one was to go near it. Guards would be posted, and a request for investigators from the capital would be sent at once. He spoke of proper procedures, of justice, but his eyes held a haunted look that belied his words. He was terrified, and his terror was contagious. The two guards, their faces grim, took up positions outside the convent gates, their pikes glinting faintly in the fading light. Their presence, meant to offer protection, felt more like a barrier, sealing off the horror within. The village became a place of hushed voices and anxious glances. The children were kept indoors, their usual boisterous games replaced by a nervous quiet. The blacksmith's hammer lay silent. The mill wheels stood still. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the full truth to emerge from behind the unyielding stone walls of St. Joseph's. I, however, couldn't wait. The magistrate's words, though vague, confirmed my worst fears and fueled my desperate need to know more. What had he seen that was so unspeakable? What were the markings? And what was the vile substance that covered the chapel? Doors? My mind replayed the scraping, the thud, the slap, and now, combined with the magistrate's shaken pronouncements, they formed a chilling narrative. That night, after everyone in our cottage was deep in sleep, I slipped out once more. The two guards would be at the main gate. But I knew another way, a rarely used, overgrown path that led to a low section of the convent wall near the old burial ground. It was a perilous route, often muddy and treacherous, but in my desperation, I hardly noticed the thorns that tore at my clothes or the sharp stones that bruised my feet. The metallic, sickly sweet scent was overwhelmingly strong now, thick in the night air, making me gag. As I neared the low wall, a faint flickering light pulsed from within the convent grounds, casting dancing shadows on the ancient trees. It seemed to emanate from the chapel. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence. I reached the wall, a jumble of loose stones, and cautiously began to climb. It was higher than I remembered, but adrenaline lent me strength. I pulled myself over the top, my boots scraping against the rough stone, and dropped softly onto the overgrown grass inside. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of death and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet. The flickering light drew me forward. I crept through the overgrown garden, past withered rose bushes, and choked. Weeds towards the chapel. The large wooden doors, which Master Thorne had spoken of, were indeed caked with a thick, dark, reddish-brown substance that shone sickly in the faint light. It was unmistakable. Blood. Not dried, but still somewhat viscous, smeared in grotesque. Patterns that were not Latin phrases or holy symbols, but crude, savage glyphs I didn't recognize. My stomach churned, and I pressed a hand to my mouth to stifle a cry. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the light. It pulsed from a stained glass window high above the chapel's main altar, a window depicting St. Joseph himself. The flickering light turned the saint's benevolent face into a horrifying animated mask, dancing with shadows. It was as if the very sanctity of the place was being consumed by an unseen malevolent force. The black veils, once a symbol of Serene devotion now felt like a shroud drawn over an unspeakable horror, and I was stepping right into its embrace.